when you pick up the Bible and you open the first pages, you read the creation account, right? Like the famous Genesis 1 creation account, 7 days, and like, God, rests on the seventh day and all that. And you're like, cool, I understand what's happening here. God created the world in 7 days, and like in this order, right? Like first the light and the dark, and it was good, and then this and then that and the other. And then God ends, right, creating humans on day 6. And then he's like, I think that's probably enough for this week. And he stops. And then you get to the next chapter, and it's like, back when the world was created, there was nothing, and then God created like a garden, created like one dude from the ground and put him in a garden. And you're like, wait a second, God created men and women just a second ago, and where did all the animals go? And like everything that I thought I knew is turned upside down. And that's because those two creation stories were written by two different people and have been smushed together in our current Bibles. And if you follow like the strand of like the logic of the creation of Genesis 1 and the logic of the creation of Genesis 2, they don't just stop there. They each continue on into other chapters sequentially, sort of weaving back and forth and in and out. And then eventually a third voice comes in with like a totally different understanding of how things happen. And then the three of those are doing their thing for like 4 books of the Bible. Then you get to Deuteronomy, the 5th one, and it's like a totally different person is writing. And that's the documentary hypothesis. 4 authors who each wrote stories that are now included in our in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books. But each of their stories has been like interwoven, like enmeshed like this by somebody who said, I don't want 4 stories, I just want one, and I'm going to put them all together.
Well, the documentary hypothesis, as it is articulated by Joel and other critical scholars, has a number of methodological problems. And this is important to consider because it can be easy to miss what the methodological assumptions are when a theory is proposed. And when these are laid bare, one of the things that it clearly shows, as we'll see here, is that there literally is nothing behind this theory. It is standing on a house of cards. Now, why do I say that? This is part 2 in a series looking at the documentary hypothesis. I did one where I looked at the alleged contradictions of Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and showed that there really is nothing to them. That is the evidence that is given for the theory. But even here, I want to look at method. Why is this kind of evidence given, and is it self-referentially valid? What I mean is based on the assumptions of critical scholars and what they demand for truth in other contexts, does the theory that they put forward with regard to the documentary hypothesis, does it meet their own standards of criteria for evidence? Now, when it comes to other issues, I'll give an example of the kinds of things that are required by critical scholars very often. When it comes to other issues, we're often told that there must be these kind of external evidences that are used to prove the events, particularly of the Bible. So, for instance, Joel, in particular, in other places, will argue that things like the Exodus or the conquest never happened. And the reason he says that is because he says there's no evidence. There's no archaeological evidence. There's nothing we can find in the ground that supports it. There's no physical evidence that can be tested that can show that this actually took place, that it actually happened. And the idea is that the Bible must be tested against these things, and if it comes up wanting, then you know that we are to jettison the theory itself, or that the events that the Bible claimed to happen, were to jettison them as being historical. Now, without question, I do not concede that there is no evidence for the Exodus. But if we just take this criteria and apply it to the documentary hypothesis, what do we come up with? The question is there any evidence for this outside of perceived disunity that is a subjective assertion coming from readers? Is there any kind of evidence for this? Is there any kind of archaeological evidence? Is there any kind of manuscript evidence for this kind of thing? What kind of evidence actually is there for the documentary hypothesis? And the answer is, amazingly, that those who require such evidence all the time, all kinds of events, can produce not a shred of this kind of evidence for the documentary hypothesis. If you were to talk about manuscript evidence, is there any evidence for it? Do we have any document at all that ever bears the marks of the documentary hypothesis, where you have a J and an E document that are clearly differentiated, that there's actually the end of one, or the alleged stitching that was done together. The idea is that there was this J document, it was cut up by a redactor and it was stitched together. Do we have any evidence of the different order that would reflect order of the alleged J author? The answer is no. What if we go to things like the Dead Sea Scrolls? Is there any evidence of this at all? The answer is no. There is not a shred of evidence that is found ever. Is there any evidence of even the evidence of stitching in any context with regard to the putting together of different manuscripts? The answer is no. Is there any evidence with regard to the various potential endings? Or what if we were to say, is there any evidence of the knowledge of these different documents at any point in the history of the entire world? The answer is no. Is there any evidence in the Bible itself of an awareness of these different kinds of theologies and the representative documents that would be eventually stitched together? The answer is no. Is there any evidence in the Bible or in any other source at all of the history of the work of redactors in this way? The answer is no. Is there any evidence in all of Jewish literature about the knowledge of these various sources and the way in which they would have had to have been brought together and the criteria for doing so? The answer is no. Is there any evidence in all of the Christian tradition with regard to the Pentateuch? Is there any knowledge of these various documents? The answer is no. For thousands of years, there is not a shred of evidence, not a shred of documentary evidence, not a shred of manuscript evidence, not a shred of historical knowledge of any of these events or any of the literary activity that is said to have taken place over centuries. There is no evidence of any of the authors. There is no evidence of the redactors. There is no knowledge of it until the modern critical scholarship endeavor to say that the Pentateuch was written by more than one person. Now, if it is true, according to the critical scholars themselves, that things like the Exodus or the conquest must have some kind of demonstrable external evidence to prove that they are true. That if we look at the archaeology and we cannot find any evidence, if we were to look at the textual data, we cannot find anything that would support the claims, then that must be considered ahistorical, non-historical. What kind of conclusion ought we to come to with regard to the documentary hypothesis on the basis of the criteria of the critical scholars themselves?